Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When I moved into this quiet suburban neighborhood, I expected peace, privacy, and weekends spent working in my garage. But then came Karen, a woman who believed everything around her was hers for the taking. She kept stealing my tools without asking, until I decided to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. I never thought that moving into my dream home would come with so much trouble. After years of hard work, I finally bought a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but exactly what I needed. It had a decent-sized backyard, a garage spacious enough for my tools, and most importantly, a sense of privacy that I had longed for after spending years in cramped apartments. I envisioned peaceful weekends working on home improvement projects, enjoying the freedom of having my own space. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors were polite, the lawns were manicured, and there was a general sense of order to the community. That should have been my first red flag. See, this wasn't just any neighborhood. It was governed by a homeowners association. I had always been skeptical about HOAs, but I figured as long as I followed the rules, I'd be left alone. I wasn't looking to cause trouble. I just wanted to live my life, mind my own business, and maybe make some friends along the way. That's when I met Karen, and by met, I mean she introduced herself by inspecting my property like a drill sergeant. The first time she approached me, she was holding a clipboard and eyeing my garage with a look of disapproval. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a middle-aged woman with a permanent scowl and an inflated sense of authority. "I see you're new here," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'm Karen, the president of the HOA. We like to keep things orderly around here." I shook her hand, trying to be polite, but I already had a bad feeling about her. She immediately launched into a lecture about trash can placement, lawn maintenance, and how the neighborhood had a certain standard that everyone was expected to uphold. I nodded along, barely listening, but one thing stuck with me. Karen had an unusual interest in my garage. "Do you work with tools?" she asked, peering past me into the open space. "Yeah," I said. "I like to build things, fix things, nothing crazy." She gave a tight smile, but there was something else behind it, a glimmer of calculation. I didn't think much of it at the time, but within days, I started noticing small things. A wrench missing here, a screwdriver not where I left it. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. Maybe I had misplaced them while working. Maybe I was just adjusting to a new routine. Then one day, I went to grab my cordless drill, and it was gone. Not misplaced, not forgotten, gone. That was when I knew something was wrong. I searched my garage from top to bottom, convinced that I had simply misplaced my drill. I checked every shelf, every toolbox, even the workbench drawers where I never kept power tools. Nothing. Frustration gnawed at me. I knew for a fact that I hadn't lent it to anyone, and yet it was gone. It wasn't just the drill. Over the next few days, I started noticing other items missing, a set of pliers, a ratchet wrench, my best tape measure. At first, I questioned my own memory, wondering if I had somehow lost them in the chaos of moving in. But deep down, I knew better. My tools weren't disappearing by accident. Someone was taking them. Then, one afternoon, I finally got my answer. I was mowing the lawn when I noticed movement across the street. Karen standing in her driveway using my cordless drill. My drill. I stopped the mower and stared. She wasn't even trying to hide it. She was casually screwing something into her wooden fence, chatting with another neighbor like this was the most normal thing in the world. I marched across the street, heart pounding. "Karen," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm, "is that my drill?" She barely glanced at me, still focused on her task. "Oh, this." "Yes, I borrowed it. I figured you wouldn't mind." I blinked, trying to process what I had just heard. "You borrowed it?" Without asking me, she let out an exaggerated sigh and finally turned to face me. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. We're neighbors. Tools are meant to be shared. It's not like I took it permanently." I clenched my jaw. "Karen, that's not how borrowing works. You don't just walk into someone's garage and take whatever you want." She gave me an exasperated look, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "Well, I would have asked, but you weren't home, and I needed to fix my fence." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "Karen, I need you to return everything you took from my garage, and from now on, don't take anything without permission." She waved a dismissive hand. "Fine, fine. I'll bring them back later, but honestly, you should relax a little. It's just tools." I should have known then that she had no intention of stopping. Over the next week, the pattern continued. My tools kept disappearing, only to reappear days later, usually in worse condition. A hammer with a splintered handle, a pair of pliers with rust spots, my screwdriver bent at a weird angle. Each time, Karen acted like it was no big deal. "Oh, that? Yeah, I borrowed it real quick. Hope you don't mind." I minded. I minded a lot. I installed a lock on my garage door, thinking that would solve the problem. The next day, I came home to find the lock broken, not picked, not tampered with, completely snapped off as if someone had bashed it open, and just like that, I knew what I was dealing with. Karen wasn't just borrowing my tools, she was stealing them. The sight of my broken garage lock sent a jolt of rage through me. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Someone had forced their way into my garage, and I didn't need to guess who it was. I stormed across the street to Karen's house, fists clenched. Her front door was slightly ajar, and before I could knock, I heard a familiar buzzing noise from inside. My jigsaw. I pushed the door open further and stepped onto the porch. "Karen!" I called out. The buzzing stopped. A moment later, she appeared in the doorway, wiping dust from her hands. She didn't even look surprised to see me. "Oh, hey," she said with a bright, completely insincere smile. I was just about to bring this back. I pushed past her, and there it was, my jigsaw sitting on her kitchen counter, covered in sawdust. Next to it was my missing wrench set and a pair of pliers that weren't just used, but completely rusted over. I turned back to her, barely containing my anger. "Karen, did you break into my garage?" Her smile faded just a little, but she quickly replaced it with a look of feigned innocence. "Oh, that." The lock was already broken when I came by. I figured it must have been jammed or something, so I just, helped myself in. "You helped yourself?" I repeated, incredulous. "Karen, that's trespassing. You don't just walk into someone's garage and take their stuff." She crossed her arms. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's not like I took your car. It's just tools. And honestly, you should be a little more generous. This is a community, after all. We help each other out." I took a step closer, my patience wearing dangerously thin. "Number, we ask for permission, and you know what else? I'm done with this. If you ever take something from my property again, I'm calling the police." For the first time, her expression darkened, her lips pursed, and she tilted her chin up defiantly. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me." We stood there, staring each other down. Finally, she rolled her eyes and huffed. "Fine, I won't touch your precious tools." Happy? I wasn't, not even close. I gathered my jigsaw, wrench set, and whatever else of mine I could see in her house and left without another word. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The next day, I found Karen in my backyard. She was leaning over my workbench, inspecting a set of drill bits like she was shopping in a hardware store. "What the hell are you doing?" I snapped. She turned casually. "Oh, relax." I wasn't taking anything. I was just looking. I stepped toward her, furious. "Get out," Karen scoffed, clearly unbothered. Wow, someone woke up on the wrong side of the bed. But she walked off, muttering about how I was being selfish and not neighborly. That's when I realized something terrifying. Karen didn't see herself as the problem. To her, I was the unreasonable one. In her mind, she was entitled to my things. She didn't just borrow, she took. And no amount of talking was going to stop her. I needed a plan. And this time, I was going to make sure Karen learned her lesson the hard way. Karen had made one thing very clear. She wasn't going to stop. She didn't respect boundaries, she didn't care about personal property, and she certainly wasn't afraid to cross the line. If I wanted her to leave my tools alone, I needed something stronger than words. I needed consequences. That's when I came up with the perfect plan. It was simple, effective, and, best of all, completely legal. If Karen was going to keep helping herself to my tools, then I would make sure she got exactly what she deserved. That night, after double-checking that my garage was locked, with a new reinforced padlock this time, I set my trap. I selected a few key tools, ones I knew Karen would be tempted to steal: a hammer, a pair of pliers, and a screwdriver. Then I pulled out a tube of industrial-strength superglue, the kind that bonds instantly on contact and takes hours to wear off. With meticulous care, I coated the handles of each tool in a thin but generous layer of glue. Not enough to be immediately obvious, but just enough to ensure that the moment someone wrapped their fingers around them, they weren't letting go anytime soon. I placed them back on the workbench in plain sight, exactly where Karen would expect to find them. Then I left the side door of the garage unlocked, an invitation she wouldn't be able to resist. Finally, I set up a security camera aimed directly at the workbench. If Karen was dumb enough to take the bait, I wanted proof. With everything in place, all I had to do was wait. The next morning, I acted like nothing was out of the ordinary. I went about my day, grabbed some coffee, chatted with a few neighbors, and pretended not to notice when Karen casually glanced at my garage 3 separate times as she walked by my house. By noon, I knew she had taken the bait. I was inside when I heard a loud, panicked screech from the direction of my garage. I stepped outside just in time to see Karen stumble backward onto my driveway, her right hand raised in horror, clutching my hammer. Correction. Her hand was now a permanent part of my hammer. Her fingers were glued solidly to the handle, and as she tried to shake it off, the hammer just swung wildly through the air like an extension of her arm. "What the hell?" she shrieked, flailing around like a lunatic. She whipped her arm up, and the hammer nearly hit her in the face. A moment later, the front door of the house across the street opened, and Mrs. Wilson stepped outside with her dog. She took one look at Karen, then at the hammer stuck to her hand, and burst out laughing. "Karen, dear," she called between chuckles, "are you doing a little home improvement?" Karen spun toward her, which only made it worse. The motion sent the hammer flying out in an arc, nearly taking out a mailbox. By now, other neighbors had started peeking out their windows. Mr. Benson, the old retiree next door, actually grabbed his phone and started filming. Karen tried to pry her fingers apart with her free hand, but it was no use. In her panic, she instinctively grabbed the pliers from my workbench to help pry her hand off, only to realize too late that they were also coated in glue. Now both of her hands were stuck to tools. I stepped out onto my porch, arms crossed, pretending to be surprised. "Karen," I called out, "are you stealing my tools again?" She whipped her head toward me, eyes blazing with fury. You did this!" I shrugged. "Did what? Leave my tools in my garage?" She tried one last desperate shake, but all she accomplished was nearly knocking herself over as the hammer and pliers swung around uncontrollably. By now, the entire street was laughing. Someone had even pulled out a lawn chair to watch the spectacle. Her face turned bright red as she realized she had made a complete fool of herself. She let out an enraged growl and ran toward her house, arms flailing, hammer and pliers still attached, looking like a lunatic. I pulled out my phone and checked my security footage. Perfect. I had everything I needed. And Karen, she wasn't done embarrassing herself yet. Karen's retreat was anything but graceful. She bolted across the street toward her house, arms flailing wildly, a hammer in one hand and pliers in the other, both stuck fast. Every few steps she tried to shake them off, but each attempt only made her look more ridiculous. The hammer swung like a medieval flail, nearly clipping her own knee, while the pliers jutted out from her other hand at an awkward angle, making her look like some deranged handyman on the loose. The street had come alive with laughter. Mrs. Wilson was nearly in tears, doubled over on her front lawn, clutching her stomach. Mr. Benson, who had always been a grumpy old man, was grinning wider than I'd ever seen him. He had his phone out, zooming in for the perfect shot. Other neighbors peeked out from their porches and windows, whispering and chuckling at the absurd spectacle. Karen made the mistake of turning back toward me. "You're going to pay for this," she screeched, her face red with rage. But as she turned to yell, she lost control of her movements, and the hammer swung forward, whacking her straight in the knee. She let out a strangled yelp and stumbled, nearly going down onto the pavement. The laughter doubled in volume. "Oh, Karen," Mrs. Wilson gasped between giggles, "you really should be more careful with those borrowed tools." Karen tried to open her front door, but failed spectacularly. She reached for the handle with her plier hand, but the awkward angle made it impossible to grip properly. Then, in her frustration, she forgot about the hammer still attached to her other hand and swung it directly into the door instead. Bang! The impact was loud enough to make a few birds fly off the telephone wires. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen. Then, with a furious scream, she kicked the door open and disappeared inside, slamming it behind her. The moment Karen vanished, the street erupted into full-blown applause. Some people even clapped. Mrs. Wilson wiped a tear from her eye. "I haven't laughed like that in years," she admitted. Mr. Benson walked over to me, still holding his phone up. "Son," he said, chuckling. "I don't know what you did, but that was a work of art." I smirked, keeping my expression neutral. "I have no idea what you're talking about, sir." At that moment, I got a notification from my security camera app. I pulled out my phone and reviewed the footage. There it was, clear as day. Karen sneaking into my garage, grabbing the tools, realizing her mistake, and then completely losing her mind in front of the entire neighborhood. I had solid proof. Still, I had a feeling she wasn't done causing trouble. I should have known Karen wouldn't accept defeat so easily. Humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, with glue-stained hands and a reputation in shambles, she wasn't going to let this go without some desperate last-ditch attempt to turn the tables. And, of course, she went straight to the nuclear option, calling the police. I had barely finished watching the last of the neighbors shuffle back inside, still chuckling at the spectacle, when I heard the distant wail of sirens. A squad car pulled up in front of Karen's house, and before the officers could even step out, she stormed toward them, waving her glue-covered hands in the air like a lunatic. "There he is. That man. He assaulted me," she shrieked, jabbing a finger toward my house. "He set a trap, booby-trapped his tools with glue, and now my hands are ruined. I want him arrested for assault and, I don't know, chemical warfare or something." I leaned against my porch railing, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. This was going to be good. 2 officers stepped out. One was Officer Reyes, who had already seen way too much of Karen over the years. His partner, a younger officer who looked like he was seconds away from laughing, took one look at Karen's hands and had to cover his mouth. "Ma'am," Reyes said, rubbing his temple, already exhausted by whatever nonsense he was about to deal with. "You're saying this man, your neighbor, attacked you?" "Yes," Karen shrieked. "He set a trap for me in his garage, knowing I'd grab his tools, and now my hands are—" She faltered for a second, realizing what she had just admitted. Reyes lifted an eyebrow. "Wait, knowing you'd grab his tools." Karen's mouth snapped shut. The younger officer, still barely containing his laughter, cleared his throat. "So, you went into his garage?" Karen hesitated, then doubled down. "That's not the point. He knew I would borrow something, and he set me up. That's entrapment. You have to arrest him." Reyes sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that said, "I don't get paid enough for this." He turned toward me. "Sir, do you have any idea what she's talking about?" I pushed off the railing and walked down toward them, completely calm. "I have no idea what she means by entrapment, officer. I keep my tools in my garage. I don't force anyone to steal them." Karen's voice hit a pitch that probably shattered glass somewhere. "I was borrowing them." I pulled out my phone. "Would you like to see the security footage?" Reyes's face lit up with relief. Yes, I would." I played the video. Every moment was there, clear as day. Karen sneaking into my garage, grabbing the tools without asking. Her panicked realization as the glue took effect. The frantic shaking, the wild flailing, the now infamous hammer swing that nearly took out her own knee. The younger officer actually burst out laughing. He turned away, shaking with silent laughter, trying to compose himself. Even Reyes, who had dealt with Karen's nonsense before, exhaled sharply, amused despite himself. Karen's face went from red to pale to furious. "This isn't funny," she shrieked. "I was tricked. He left those tools out knowing I'd—" She stopped herself again. She just kept digging her own grave. Reyes, still staring at my phone, nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I've seen enough." He turned toward Karen, now in full disappointed dad mode. "Ma'am, here's what I see," he said. "I see you trespassing. I see you stealing from your neighbor, and I see you making a complete fool of yourself in broad daylight." Karen looked like she was going to explode. "And now," Reyes continued, "you're wasting police resources because you're embarrassed." Karen's lips trembled. The younger officer wiped a tear from his eye, barely able to keep it together. "So, you want us to arrest you for theft? Or do you want to let this go?" Karen stiffened. Her entire body shook with the sheer effort of not screaming. Then, in the most hilariously reluctant tone I'd ever heard, she muttered, "We'll let this go." Reyes gave a satisfied nod. "Good choice." The officers left. Karen turned to glare at me one last time, pure hatred in her eyes, before stomping toward her house and slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a second, letting it all sink in. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Mr. Benson. Check the HOA Facebook group. I opened it. Someone, probably Mrs. Wilson, had already uploaded the video. The comments were brutal. Is Karen okay? It looked like she was trying to perform an exorcism with a hammer. If you steal something and end up looking like an idiot, is it still theft or just karma? I hope this teaches her to stop sticking her nose where it doesn't belong. The hammer chose its rightful owner. I smirked. Karen had officially lost. Karen didn't show her face for the rest of the day. Not that I blamed her. After making a complete spectacle of herself, she was the laughingstock of the entire neighborhood. By the next morning, the video had spread beyond the HOA Facebook group and was making its way through local community forums. Karen's infamous hammer flail was now legendary. The comments kept rolling in. People she didn't even know mocked her entitlement, her hypocrisy, and her sheer stupidity. Some called her the Tool Goblin. Others compared her to a video game boss that had accidentally equipped cursed weapons. But the best part? The HOA board had seen everything. 2 days later, an emergency HOA meeting was called. The email was short and to the point. All members are encouraged to attend as we discuss recent issues regarding ethical conduct and leadership. That was HOA speak for. Karen's reign was coming to an end. I didn't usually bother with these meetings, but this time... Oh, I wouldn't miss it for the world. The room was packed. Even people who never attended these things had shown up, eager to witness Karen finally get what she deserved. She sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. The HOA president, Mr. Caldwell, cleared his throat. We've received numerous complaints regarding recent events involving our HOA representative Karen, he began. We've also reviewed some rather interesting footage. A murmur spread through the room. Karen's face twitched. She knew exactly what footage he meant. Mr. Caldwell sighed. Let me be clear. This association was founded on the principles of community, respect, and property rights. Unfortunately, we've seen repeated behavior that violates those principles. Someone in the back muttered, "You mean theft?" Karen shot up from her seat. This is ridiculous. I have done nothing but serve this community. Mr. Caldwell raised a hand, silencing her. Karen, let's not make this worse. We're voting on your removal as an HOA representative today. We'll keep this democratic. Those in favor? Every single hand went up. Karen stood frozen. Her eyes darted around the room as if she still had some kind of chance, but there was nothing left. Mr. Caldwell nodded. It's decided. Effective immediately. You are removed from your position. And just like that, she was done. Karen stormed out of the meeting, her face burning with humiliation. She pushed past me in the hallway, but I couldn't resist. I leaned in slightly and whispered, "Maybe you should try asking next time." She whipped around, seething, but she didn't say a word. She had already lost. As I walked back home, a few neighbors patted me on the back. Glad someone finally put her in her place. You did the whole street a favor. I didn't set out to become a hero, but damn, it felt good to win. For the next few weeks, Karen was a ghost. No more obnoxious HOA emails. No more complaints about trash cans being 1 inch too close to the curb. And best of all, no more stolen tools. It was like the entire neighborhood had taken a collective deep breath, finally free from the tyranny that had ruled over it for years. She barely left her house. If she did, it was only to scurry to her car, head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The once overconfident woman who had strutted around the neighborhood like she owned it now moved like a fugitive. No one spoke to her. No one greeted her. Then, one morning, a moving truck pulled into her driveway. The moment people saw the for sale sign go up, the entire neighborhood knew. Karen was leaving. I was in my garage when I saw her struggling to load a box into her car. For a moment, I debated ignoring her. Let her leave without another word. She had made my life hell for months. I owed her nothing. But then, curiosity got the best of me. I walked across the street and leaned against my fence. Moving, huh? Karen stiffened, then turned around slowly. She looked tired, not just physically, but completely drained. "What does it look like?" she muttered, shoving another box into her trunk. I studied her for a second. "Guess the HOA board didn't want you around anymore." Her jaw tightened. "Guess not." For the first time, she had nothing to say. No snark, no condescension, just bitter resignation. I could have gloated. I could have thrown every smug remark back in her face. But looking at her now, defeated and humiliated, it didn't feel necessary. So instead, I just said, "Hope you learn to respect boundaries wherever you end up next." She shot me a glare, but it was weak, hollow. Then, without another word, she slammed her trunk shut and walked inside. By the end of the day, she was gone. Life in the neighborhood improved immediately. The new HOA leadership actually listened to residents instead of policing them. People were more relaxed, friendlier. For the first time since moving in, it actually felt like home. One evening, Mrs. Wilson passed by while walking her dog. "You know," she said, "ever since Karen left, this place has been a lot more peaceful." "Yeah," I agreed. "It's amazing what happens when you take out the one person making everyone miserable," she chuckled. "By the way, I saw your video has over 50,000 views now." I smirked. I stopped checking after it hit 10. She grinned. "Well, if you ever decide to set another trap, let me know. I'll bring popcorn." As I sat on my porch that night, looking out at my peaceful street, I thought about everything that had happened. I hadn't planned on teaching Karen a lesson, but she had refused to respect boundaries, refused to listen, refused to believe that rules applied to her. And in the end, she was the one who ruined herself. I took a sip of my drink and smiled. Some people learn the easy way. Karen learned the hard way.